Della storia, bacca storia, den nostra förutta, yeah, nostalgier.
Hello my dear friends, how are you? I'm Seidr and today I'm going to talk about the drum of the volva. That is the instrument of the prophetess or seeress of the pre-Christian Old Norse society. This was a question posed by one of my patrons, again, Miss Margaret Whitmer. Thank you so much, madam. I've given my answer obviously a long time ago and shared it among all of my patrons as I usually do. And now I have decided to put it on video format so I can share it with all of you, obviously. Because I think it's actually a pretty good question that might help a lot of people understanding this idea of a drum used by the Old Norse volva, a prophetess or practitioner of Seidr, which is mainly a divination art with Sami shamanic performances. Now, the question was specifically related to a video I have done about Viking Age music instruments, which you can see right here, where I have stated on that video that drums in Old Norse society were never found and there aren't written sources referring to any drum from the part of Viking Age people. There are references, however, to a kind of a very strange drum-like instrument used by continental Germanic peoples, which consisted in a wooden structure with an animal hide stretched on it, and by beating it, it would produce a sound, but no actual references to any sort of drum for the Scandinavian peoples of the Viking period. Music instruments in pre-Christian Scandinavia did not include a drum. The drum is found specifically in Sami culture, but not in Old Norse society, which made a lot of people obviously question what I said in that video concerning the drum. Because there is this general idea that even if the drum wasn't used as a music instrument, well, surely there must have been drums, since the volva, the prophetess, used one. And that's exactly where our first problem resides. Because the volva is linked to Seidr, and Seidr is generally perceived as being Norse shamanism, although it isn't. There are some traces of shamanic understandings in Seidr, surely, but it isn't fully shamanism. As I said, it is mostly a divination method, and even if it were actual shamanism, there's no reason whatsoever to believe that the volva used a drum. We usually transport the idea of the drum based on some Siberian cultures, as well as obviously the Sami from the Arctic regions of Scandinavia, which we know they used drums, although the oldest Sami drum ever found dates back to the 18th century, if I'm not mistaken. Shamanism is a widely spread religious and spiritual phenomenon. It is something quite universal, and in many shamanic cultures, a drum isn't required at all. It's not specifically the drum that is the key element to aid the shaman into achieving a state of ecstasy and induce in trance. The drum is merely a utensil to create vibration, resonance, and it's that resonance through rhythm that aids the shaman in the process of entering in a state of ecstasy to help inducing an out-of-body experience. This resonance through rhythm can be created with a variety of objects, and even through the action of singing and dancing. There is a wondrous variety of musical instruments that are used for the exact same purpose, and they don't even get close to a drum in shape or the sound a drum produces. The point here is resonance through rhythm. More often than not, a state of ecstasy is achieved through some action not related to music, but with the objective of reaching an extreme point the body can't take any longer, and that will end up induce an out-of-body experience. Now, it's also important to remember that in Old Norse society, shamanism, sorcery, any sort of magical art or performance progressively became something quite abnormal in the Viking Age society. Such performances were usually attributed to foreigners, mostly to Finns and to the Sami, and as such people were seen as aliens, strange people, abnormal, with strange customs. There was in fact a lot of pejorative ideas from the part of the Old Norse people towards the Finns and the Sami. The Old Norse people were quite racist towards the Sami and the Finns. And this is quite noticeable actually in the sagas, as most evil people in the Old Norse written sources are either Finns or Sami. Most of the time the Old Norse people don't actually even make distinctions between the two, and only point out that the place of evil people, usually sorcerers of great renown or somewhat linked to magical performances, and therefore strange, abnormal and evil people, come from outside Old Norse society, from Lapland. And calling Finns and Sami and all those other people, calling them Lapps and from Lapland, it is extremely racist. You should not use Lapps and Lapland to designate these cultures and these people. And I've actually only recently discovered that because until quite late as the 20th century, they were referred to as Lapps and living in Lapland, even in the academic studies. That's a very pejorative term. If you don't know how to call the region, it's Sapmi, right? Now, returning to what we were exploring in the Viking Age society, magical arts of any sort, shamanism as well, everything that was slightly a performance related to the supernatural and the contact with the supernatural that involved practices outside the normative behavior expressed by the Old Norse social mentality began to be placed completely aside from the regular lives of Old Norse people. This is especially noticeable during the Viking Age period, when there is a great change of mentality, especially provoked precisely by the contact Scandinavians had with other cultures and with other religions as well, and progressively brought those religious ideas into Scandinavia. Now, what I said until now, I think it's important for you to take in mind to understand the rest of this video. Because, as I've said, the patron asked me a question related to the video I've done about music instruments in the Viking Age period. And the question was specifically this one. If there were no drums in the Viking Age, how come the volva was buried with her drum? So, this will be the main point of this video, trying to answer the main question, was the volva buried with her drum? Well, if so, indeed drums were part of the material culture of the Old Norse people, obviously. So let's see what we can say about the drum of the volva. And for those seeking answers concerning this subject, I can honestly say that this video will be both disappointing but also an eye-opener that may change your entire perception of Seidr. The Old Norse volva has been wrongly portrayed as the Norse shaman or witch for the past half a century or so. A volva was a cirrus, and we know there was possibly trance involved, or trance was induced, but there are no evidences showing how this trance was actually induced or if it was trance at all. We have a pretty good account of the work of a volva to a certain extent in the Old Norse society, which, as you know, comes in the written source of Eiríks Saga Ralda. But she doesn't appear to belong to the actual Old Norse society, but rather a native woman, possibly from Greenland. That's one of the very few Old Norse written sources that directly deals with the performance of a volva, a cirrus, a prophetess, and she may have been a native to Greenland, which would make sense since such performances had been already forbidden in Scandinavia. And the source in question even specifically mentions that the song that is required to be sang so the volva can do her work had already been forgotten. Only a young Christian girl remembers the song because an older woman used to sing it to her when she was little, which shows that such performances and songs and all that encompasses these performances for divination purposes had already been forgotten by then. And if not for the young Christian girl remembering a childhood song, well, the performance by the volva would have never been possible. And if the volva in question was indeed a native from Greenland, her divination performance wasn't even known in Scandinavia. And this account in Eiríks Saga Ralda may be referring to actually a native performance of Greenland alone. She's called a volva, and the performance is related to Seidr, but those are two Old Norse terms, familiar to the Old Norse people, and as such applied to something that it, in its essence, resembles what the Old Norse people had a certain idea about from the past. Precisely what we do today. Anything that slightly resembles shamanism, we immediately call it shamanism, or we call it magic as a general term for the lack of understanding of what the thing actually is. So, in this particular account, it's possible, quite possible, that Seidr and volva are simply two terms used by the Old Norse people to understand a native performance that wasn't even originally a Scandinavian custom. In Eiríks Saga Ralda, there is never any reference to a drum, just a song to help the volva in contacting with the spirits. The utensil that is usually related to the volva isn't a drum, but a staff or wand. The only thing left about the staffs and wands, of course, aside from what we find in the archaeological record, are a few written sources speaking about the staffs specifically, but nothing is actually told of how the staff was used or under what circumstances, at least as far as I have researched about this subject, and I have researched quite a lot. In the written sources, we know that the staff was held by the volur, plural of volva, but there is no mention whatsoever of its purpose in the actual Seidr performance. It appears to have been a symbol of the volva's power, an object to mark what she was, a status symbol, to differentiate her from other practitioners of any other sort of magical art that wasn't Seidr. The staff or wand was clearly important enough to be buried with the volur, with the prophetesses. And it seems to me there's no question that it was one of the main tools of the Volva's trade. In fact, in the burials we find of volur, of prophetesses or seeresses, they have been buried with a distaff, specifically made of metal, usually iron. And this seems not to have been the actual tool, but a status symbol. While in the sources we have references to göndull, or a gandre, or a volder, which are wand-like utensils, phallic in shape, which seems to have been the actual tool of the Seidr performer. And they may have been made of perishable materials, and they are never found in the archaeological record. But we do find boxes buried with prophetesses that may have contained these wands and other things to aid the prophetesses in their performances. There are only a few written sources that specifically mention the tool of the volva, and such sources are so few that you can count them with the fingers of just one hand, and you still have fingers left. For instance, in Viking's saga, there is a curious indication about the use of a staff, but it is very confusing. It is a spåkona, specifically, which is another term for volva, which means, well, specifically a woman related to the art of divination, that uses the staff and gives it to a member of the council, of the thing, and tells him to hit 3 times with the staff on the cheek of another member of the council, which makes the man forget some matter I don't recall either. Thereafter, the staff is used again in the same manner, but on the right cheek, and the man comes back to himself. He starts to remember. It doesn't matter. The point of this is that one member of the council was having trouble with another, and what he wanted to be sort of implemented was being denied by the other man of the council, of the thing. So he resorted to the magical performances of the spåkona, and the power of her staff did the trick on the other man. I think the most curious thing actually in this account is that the staff has a name. I don't remember which one. Now, this is important because normally, with a few exceptions of course, objects are only given individual names if they are regarded as being of great worth, like swords, for instance, and almost any kind of object associated with the gods. So it seems that in this account, the staff is indeed an important object with a name of its own, so giving it personality to the object, possibly because of the belief that it actually contains a spirit, so it is alive, and therefore it is a supernatural object or entity which aids the volva. I have a video precisely about this, which I urge you to watch if you can, right here in this right upper corner, about the helping spirits in Seidr, where I speak a little bit about the göndull as a spiritual entity and helping spirit being held and sent forth with the aid of a tool, which is called a göndull, which is a staff or a wand, usually with a phallic shape. And in the sources and also later on in folklore, it is the tool that aids the sorcerer, and it is from it that the mind of the sorcerer in the shape of an animal, a fylgja, is sent forth on an errand or to cause mischief or harm. I do not specifically mention the staff or wand that much on that video, but there is an important parallel here with shamanism and wands used by certain northern Siberian shamans actually to hold the spirits in them, in those wands. In some Siberian shamanic cultures, sending forth a spirit can be with the aid of a staff, or even staffs with crossbars, iron crossbars to hold the spirits there. This may be the göndull, actually, the tool of the volva. It can very well have been the staff serving this same purpose, to hold on the spirits to it and send them forth, as we often read in Seidr performances, as the practitioner of Seidr sending forth the mind, usually in the form of its own fylgja, as I've said, sending forth the magical projectile, which is also called göndull, sending it through the göndull, through the tool, which is clearly an object with a phallic shape. Might have been the main purpose of the staff, or the tool that isn't found in the archaeological record. So, like this, we understand why the staff has a name in this particular account I have mentioned. Usually, that was the reason why objects were given names, because they contained a spirit and therefore were alive and had a personality of their own. For more information about that, the spirits in objects, please do check the video I've done, if you can, obviously, concerning talismans in Old Norse religion. Anyway, the actual tool of the volva was the göndull, the staff or wand, and not the drum. In Scandinavia during the Viking period, shamanism seems to have been dismissed in great part from the Old Norse society and was merely observed outside this cultural reality. Old Norse written sources show us that Old Norse people thought about shamanism as sorcery and or wizardry, as they observed such practices outside their cultural reality, among the Sami and the Finns, who were always regarded as sorcerers, wizards, trolls and whatnot, in a pejorative sense. Now, as I've said, I've done that one video about musical instruments in the Viking Age, and the drum is missing, for good reason. You can see the video by clicking this information icon in this right upper corner, as I've said. Now, when we talk about trance and shamanism, what often comes to mind is the drum as the instrument with which the shaman induces trance by the constant rhythmic beating. However, shamanism is a vast global cultural, social, religious and spiritual reality. And each cultural reality uses different instruments, herbs, techniques, etc. to induce a trance state of mind. We often think about the drum because we are used to see Siberian shamanism being portrayed and carried to other cultural realities. In fact, the term shamanism, as you know it, and shaman comes from the Tungusic language, spoken specifically in eastern Siberia. So we have been transporting a lot of conceptions from the belief system of these specific people into all other shamanic cultures. The drum is very much used in many places all over the world, obviously, there is no dispute, but out-of-body experiences is often provoked by a violent ordeal that leads to near-death experience. And the drum, or any other musical instrument, is hardly used for that. Drum induces ecstasy to achieve trance, but a stage of trance not as deep as out-of-body experiences provoked by trauma or some other kind of ordeal. When we hear of the volva and the trance associated with her, we assume there was the use of a drum due to our lack of knowledge on shamanism itself and the idea that a drum is always present, transporting what we know from a few cultures and placing the information in everything that slightly resembles shamanism. As another YouTuber said, and in part right and in part wrong, and I quote, "The volva herself or someone else, mostly young girls at the ritual, would sing a song for the spirits to the sound of drums." It is true that we have evidences of the volva the prophetess being accompanied by youths who sang songs, probably high-pitched vocals, something akin to modern-day herding calls such as kulning or lolning or kokning, something we can associate with göldur perhaps, or what göldur must have sounded like. But there are no indications whatsoever of the use of drums. As I said before, the volva is not to be confused with the shaman. The volva seems to perform certain aspects also reflected within shamanism, or certain notions, but not fully shamanism. In shamanism, dancing and drumming are generally used by shamans to induce a state of ecstasy, not trance yet. And the great majority of ceremonies are for healing purposes in shamanism, which is not the case of Seidr. In Norse accounts of Seidr, there isn't any reference to drumming or dancing, nothing of it, just singing by others, by a choir that ranged from 15 young girls to 30. And the volva's purpose in her ceremonies was never concerning healing. So the picture we nowadays have of the volva and Seidr with drums and dancing and healing purposes is incorrect. The volva was not a healer, and drums and dancing were not part of Seidr rites, Seidr performances. The volva was a seeress, a prophetess. The volva did practice Seidr, but Seidr was essentially a divination ceremony, and sometimes used for hostile purposes to affect someone's mind. Not strictly cursing, but to change the will of a person with the influence of the göndull, the magical projectile which is the mind of the Seidr performer in the shape of an animal, which is usually the philia of the person who is sending forth this spirit. This has close parallels actually with the göndulls of the Sami. Practically the same thing as I've explained in the other videos I've recommended about the helping spirits in Seidr. But I shall explore this in future videos, of course, specifically when it comes to Vard Lokur, the song we find precisely in Erik's Saga Ralba, which bears parallels with some Sami performances in shamanism, which leads to the belief that most volur, the plural of the volva, were actually not Old Norse people, but Sami or Finnish natives, which explains the sources telling us that the volva, Seitkona or the Spokana, were women, wandering women performing their arts throughout the countryside. And we know that such people were called by jarls and even kings at some point to perform their sorcery, as it is so labeled in Old Norse written sources. So the volva was an outsider actually, possibly not even from the Old Norse society, as such practices became forbidden pretty quickly during the Viking Age period. But more on that in the future, of course. But now concerning the video on the music instruments, and the question posed by one of my patrons was precisely, if drums were not used, why were drums buried with the volur, with the prophetesses? The answer is quite simple, I think. Drums were not buried with volvas, with the volur. And the very item that marks the difference between the grave of a volva and the grave of some other person is precisely metal staffs or wands, the distaff, as previously spoken. Staffs were the items of the volva, as she was a prophetess, a seeress, and such staffs served as scepters to mark her position in society, as well as her main tool, as previously said. I must admit that for some years I thought drums were a common thing among the volur, plural for volva, and that such drums had been found in the archaeological record actually. But to my disappointment, in the countless archaeological reports of volva contexts, there are no drums whatsoever, Nothing. And I have read quite a lot of archaeological reports. You know it to be true. And I even once posed that question to Dr. Neil Price, and indeed no drums have ever been found in such contexts. Surely Viking Age people must have known about drums, and we have written evidences of the use of drums in music, but after the Viking Age period. But surely they knew about drums from the contact with both Sami and Finns, even though, archaeologically speaking, Sami drums that have survived to our days are found in archaeological context, in great part date from the 19th century, not the 18th century as I've previously said, sorry, but 19th century. But we know it is a long tradition which contains the use of the drum before the 19th century, possibly. Even though drums have never been found in Viking Age / Old Norse contexts, we must consider, of course, the possible Norse use of the drum, which is indeed the object that forms one of the primary attributes of shamans across the circumpolar region. So the drum could have been hardly missed by Old Norse people. They surely knew about its existence and its use in shamanism, even if it was only through observing their neighboring peoples using the drum, the Sami and the Finns, from Sápmi and Finland. Now, in the written sources, there is only one single incident in which possibly the drum may have been mentioned. The passage from Lokasenna 24th, if I'm not mistaken, in which Odin is accused by Loke of practicing Seidr. Pay close attention to this. The god in question is said to have drautu av vet som volur, meaning tapped on a vet, like the volur, plural for volva. This vet in academia was often understood to refer to a drum. To be more precise, actually to a shamanic drum, not a regular drum. So Odin, in his performance of Seidr, tapped on a shamanic drum like the volur, like the seeresses and the prophetesses. This is the only Old Norse written source where we might actually be in the presence of a reference to a drum. However, this is a very problematic interpretation. There is no doubt that the vet was some kind of instrument to be struck or beaten, or rather tapped lightly. But it must be underlined that the most obvious idea that comes to mind is immediately a drum. But this is purely conjecture. As said before, no trace of drums has ever been found in Norse archaeological contexts. And mind that I am referring to the Norse people, not Bronze Age people, and certainly not after the Middle Ages, but the period between the Iron Age and the Viking period in Scandinavia, which is when we find precisely sources referring to the volva, to the volur, the prophetesses. So drums have never been found in the archaeological record in Norse context, nor anything that might resemble a drum, hammer, or beater. But it is quite strange, indeed, the lack of drums and drum beaters in Norse contexts, when we consider the contrast with the Sami cultural area, Sápmi, and the relatively numerous finds of both drums and drum beaters. In Sami cultural area, we find more drum beaters than actual drums, since Sami drums have mostly been preserved in ethnographic collections, not archaeological contexts, sorry. Now, I think it is also important to refer that the vet was a kind of a lid for a tube or a barrel, and buckets have been found in the graves of supposed volur, prophetesses. So this may be the actual vat referred in Lokasenna. So was it a bucket that was beaten by the volur? Mind that due to the Western society detachment from shamanism and a hasty attempt to understand Siberian shamanism only during the 19th century from the anthropologist's point of view, with a mind completely rooted in Western monotheistic religions, the several works on shamanism are a distorted Western imagery of the real thing. Also, due to New Age and core shamanism and a variety of contemporary neo-pagan drum groups and drum circles, there is without a doubt a lack of imagination when it comes to shamanism. And shamanism in the modern Western world is strictly understood from either 19th century anthropology studies or from New Age inventions and romanticized ideas. So the drum is often seen as the primary object or utensil of the shaman. However, it must be noted that in many parts of the circumpolar world, including Sami, drums were quite frequently replaced in the rituals and ceremonies by other objects, such as pot lids, pieces of wood, or anything else on which a beat could be maintained. With the lack of an actual drum, many other objects were used, and this may in fact be the reason why we do not find actual drums in Viking Age or Old Norse archaeological contexts. It's actually quite possible that we have found in archaeological contexts everyday items that have been used as substitutes for drums, but obviously discarded as regular objects because we do not link them to drum and ritual, such as pot lids and buckets and wooden bowls. The bucket indeed produces a hollow sound, which could serve as a substitute for a drum, and the drum and other objects that are used for a rhythmic beat are not supposed to induce trance, but in fact induce ecstasy, eventually to achieve trance, which by other means facilitates trance. It's curious to notice that in folk traditions, to this day, many pot lids, buckets, pots and pans in general are still used to ward off evil spirits or to call upon spirits in many places of at least the Northern Hemisphere. Let's not forget that in pre-Christian Scandinavia, there were a great number of spirits and land spirits and wights and invisible entities and the invisible population in general, as well as spirits of the land. And beating on objects to make quite a loud and noisy sound was to either ward off such spirits or to call upon them. So would a bucket produce a hollow sound to call upon spirits? Yes, it's quite possible, as some Seidr performances are indeed to call upon the spirits and or to wake up the Völva, the prophetess, from her trance. In fact, many Seidr performances were done from atop burial mounds, and according to the song Vard Lokur, performed by the Völva in the account Eric's Sagaralda, as we previously said, she was calling upon the spirits of the dead, the ancestors. So the hollow sound of the bucket or any other object that produce a sound and can be written, can be maintained, just like the rattles found in the Osberg ship burial, was to wake up the dead, maybe. Also, the idea of the vet as a drum is reinforced by its use in certain kennings for shields. In other words, calling a shield a drum, a vet precisely, which indicated that shields might have been used as substitutes for drums. And as I have pointed out in the video about Viking Age musical instruments, Ibn Fadlan's account of the ship cremation on the Volga in 922 of the Common Era, he tells us, as you know it, about a group of men which he describes as having and using shields and staves to beat in unison before or during the sacrifice of a slave girl. Ibn Fadlan interprets this as purely to make loud noises to muffle the screams of the sacrificed slave girl, which indeed could also have that purpose, of course, so that other girls, other slave girls, won't be frightened and in the future end up refusing to volunteer for sacrifice at their own master's funerals. But I think this is rather unlikely, and it is merely an idea from Ibn Fadlan, who wasn't yet familiar with the custom and made his interpretation from the point of view of an outsider and from a completely different cultural background, obviously, and even religious background. The beating of the shields and the shields themselves could be substitutes for drums. We know that Old Norse people had some disdain, scorn even, and quite racist and had xenophobic views about the Sami and the Finns, and vice versa, obviously. The Finns also thought that tattooing their bodies was ugly and effeminate, so Finns thought their neighboring men, including Norse people, were effeminate for tattooing their bodies. So Finns from Finland would not tattoo their bodies under any circumstance because they did not want to adopt the same cultural aspects of their Norse neighbors, and they did not want to look like them. Just as the Sami were reluctant in accepting Norse customs, including that of the horse sacrifices. The drum was used by both Sami and Finns, so the Old Norse people would have a certain reluctance in using actual drums, and instead used objects to beat them and replace the drum. Now, aside from the metal staffs, these staffs, rods and wands that indicate that the grave belongs to a volva, a prophetess, we often find with them, with the prophetesses, with the volur, buckets as well. Answering the patron's question, no, the volva was not buried with a drum, but she was buried with a bucket. I must reinforce again that drums, or in this case shamanic drums, were never associated with the volur, never associated with the prophetesses or seeresses of Old Norse society. There is no doubt that one object above all others is characteristic of the sorcerer's equipment, or the equipment of the volva or the Seidr performer, and that was the staff. But it could also have been the bucket. Please stick around a little longer and I'll show you two examples at least. We have this beautiful example right here. Take a good look. The reconstruction of a Berka chamber grave. The woman in this context was buried with rich grave goods, including imports, and all the richly material culture in this case shows that this woman was a person of some importance in her society. There's the particular element of the staff, a status symbol, possibly marking her condition as a prophetess, or some relation to divination and such other arts, to Seidr. There is the curious presence of a silver crucifix. There's a mixture of religious symbols in here, but this doesn't have to immediately indicate she was a Christian, mind that, as this is a grave of the late 9th century and early 10th century, which was specifically important time marking a great religious shift in Scandinavia, but a considerable amount of Scandinavians at this time adopted a variety of foreigner religious symbols, religious conceptions, and deities as well, a cultural syncretism to enrich the already existing religious background. The more the merrier. So, the crucifix here doesn't necessarily mean a devotion to Christ, but it is held as an item holding supernatural power or making a direct connection with the supernatural. In this context, the presence of the cross would be simply as an object of spiritual power. And the fact that it is a symbolism of a different faith would not contradict its use in a non-Christian ritual context, but to reinforce it, actually. Now, the interesting aspect of this burial of a volva is precisely the bucket. Is this the vat we spoke earlier as the substitute for the drum? Let's see another example. Of course, I'm not going through all the examples there are, otherwise we would be here until next year, obviously. Quite terrible. Now, we have another beautiful example somewhere in here of another woman in a chamber grave from Burka as well. On her belt there hung a leather pouch, there's a small whetstone, an iron knife. She was wearing a conventional Viking age female dress, necklaces, beads, brooches. It is likewise a grave richly adorned. Over her dress, the woman was wearing a woolen cloak lined with and trimmed with beaver fur, so this wasn't an ordinary person, clearly with a considerable social status in her community, just like the previous example from the same place. And just like the previous example, this woman was also buried with a silver embroidered silk band around her temples, just above the eyes. Fancy rich girl. Anyway, resting across the woman's knees, there's a strong suggestion that she might have been buried sitting on something or in a sitting position. And across her knees was an iron staff. It was probably cradled in her hands. The shaft extended down to the floor on the woman's right side, where it rested inside a wooden bucket with an iron handle. The bucket's handle was standing vertically, resting against the shaft of the staff. At the foot of the grave, in the southeast corner, if I'm not mistaken, there was a heavily ornamented iron box with complex animal head fasteners. No findings were recovered from the box, however. Whatever was in there, inside the box, was made of perishable materials, just like the bucket. The wood was completely gone, but luckily its handle and nails were of iron. Those remained, giving us the proportion of the bucket and just where it stood, and its negative on the floor of the grave. The box was either buried empty or with organic materials, although the box has a strong parallel with a similar box found in the Osberg ship material, which is another context that strongly implies the presence of either a queen or a very important prophetess for that community, since the material culture in there on the Osberg ship burial is ritually linked to the religious life and contains a lot of material that strongly indicates cultic practices. In fact, the box parallel to this one example contained precisely a set of equipment for cultic activities, including a possible staff of sorcery, the göndull. So the box in this example might have contained something similar. The staff or wand we often see referred to in the written sources as either göndull, volur, or gandr, specifically a utensil phallic in shape for the practice of sorcery, whilst the iron staff is the status symbol of the volva. So, two different objects. This was yet another example of the four staff graves at Berka, with parallels with a lot of other places throughout the Old Norse Scandinavian cultural world. The presence of the iron staff in these contexts indicate that this was a primary requisite of the grave goods of these volur, these prophetesses or seeresses. Three things to take into consideration or into account when we find such graves: the presence of an iron staff as being the status symbol of the volva, the presence of a bucket, which seems to always follow graves containing a volva, a prophetess. Possibly this is the vet we spoke earlier, the substitute for the drum, because the main objective is to beat on something, creating a hollow sound, in this case, the bucket, and therefore create resonance. And also the rich grave goods accompanying these women. Look for a box, and if it contains something. In the Osberg ship burial, it contained equipment for cultic performances, as well as a wand of sorcery. So, if nowadays, for some reason, you want to recreate the lifestyle of a volva, of an Old Norse prophetess, or practitioner of Seidr, start with the material culture and forget the drum. Start with the metal stuff. You will need an iron staff to mark your position in society, and everybody will know who you are. And you need a göndull as well, a wand or staff with a phallic shape, with which you will call upon the spirits and hold them there and send them forth on an errand. I'll have 2 videos speaking precisely about this in the description of this video, which you should check if you want to learn a little bit more about this utensil and sending forth the spirit göndull, or the magical projectile with the same name. Now, go on and have fun. Ah yes, I thought I was hearing some noises underneath the table. Look who's here. It's Gigi. Where's your sister? Alright, my dear friends, thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, tack för idag.